All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar for early career professionals, Standing Out in a Good Way, Writing a Personal Statement by Dan Capron, Elizabeth Dalton, and Nathaniel Van Kirk. My name is Astrid Masfar. I am the Senior Education and Outreach Coordinator here at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time and we'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the very end. I would now like to introduce our presenters. Dr. Elizabeth Dalton is an assistant professor of psychology at Elizabethtown College. Dr. Dalton teaches undergraduate courses in clinical and health psychology and conducts research examining the effects of stress on health behavior engagement in undergraduate students. Dr. Daniel Capron is Anita Bell-Suggs Professor of Psychology at the University of Southern Mississippi. He joined the USM faculty after graduating from Florida State University in 2015. He is also the director of the USM Anxiety and Trauma Research Program. Dr. Nathaniel Van Kirk is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in severe anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and trauma and PTSD. At McLean Hospital, Dr. Van Kirk is the coordinator of inpatient group therapy and the coordinator of clinical assessment at the OCD Institute. I'm now going to take a moment to pass the screen to our first presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Dalton.
Hello. Thank you so much, Astrid, for that introduction. Just to give you a little bit more information about sort of the position I'm in now before we launch into teaching or talking about teaching statements. So as Astrid mentioned, I teach at a small liberal arts college, Elizabethtown College, where I have a 3-3 teaching load. It's entirely undergraduate. And some of my other responsibilities include mentoring and advising undergraduate students, and I run a research lab where I involve undergrads in my research as well. So that type of position that I'm in now is pretty representative of the types of positions I was looking at and applying to when I was on the job market. And so I'll kind of speak to my understanding about teaching statements and philosophies from that perspective. So just to start out with, for those of you who have applied or might have started looking into teaching-oriented positions, you might notice that there's a variety of different types of materials that are requested of you from these various positions. And so you are likely to encounter a request for a teaching statement, or sometimes referred to as a teaching philosophy. You might also encounter requests for a teaching portfolio, so I'll talk a little bit more about that today too. And then additionally, you might encounter requests for a separate research statement or diversity statement or a personal statement that might encompass all of those aspects. So it's going to vary a little bit in terms of what you see requested. And then needless to say, you'll also be asked, of course, for a cover letter and CV, which were covered in separate webinars in this series. So you can check those out for more information. So just to start us off, talking a little bit more about the teaching statement or teaching philosophy. So this is a document that's really meant to serve as sort of a professional reflection on your teaching experience and speaks to sort of who you are and what you believe as an educator. And it should also provide the reader with kind of a snapshot of who you are as a teacher in the classroom. So ideally, it gives the reader a sense of what it's like to be a student in your classroom and what it's like to have you as a teacher. And Importantly, this is a document that you will sort of continue to develop over time. So typically once you're in a teaching-oriented position, the teaching philosophy or teaching statement is going to be part of your tenure and promotion materials. And so it will provide you with an ongoing opportunity to reflect on and speak to who you are as an educator, consider how that has evolved and grown over time, and that kind of thing. So it's really a living document, but at this moment, it's sort of intended to show the prospective institution what you could bring to them and how you are as an educator in the classroom. Now, if you are asked to provide an additional teaching portfolio or additional materials, this could also serve as a place to sort of introduce your reader to what those materials are going to be and what's going to be included in that portfolio. So when you consider the teaching statement, there are a few things that you're trying to convey and provide in this document. So a big question that you're trying to answer and that you can start to consider is, why do you teach? What inspires you to teach? What are the things that you value as an educator? What do you hope to impart upon your students through your teaching? What you believe to be true about teaching. So this can include things like the particular principles or values that you hold or espouse as an educator. And then finally, how you teach. So specific examples of things like methods that you use in the classroom, activities that you like to have your students do, and sort of conveying both the why and the how through that teaching statement. In terms of some of the do's and don'ts, a major thing to do is to include very specific examples. So based on the time that you've spent as a TA or as a lecturer or in your own class, it's really helpful to draw on particular instances of, say, maybe a time that you worked with a student who was really struggling to learn a particular concept, and, as a result of your interventions, they made a lot of improvement. You could also speak to specific examples of class activities that have, ideally gone well, things that you do in the classroom that are sort of innovative. And so it's better to draw on, really specific examples and scenarios that have happened, rather than sort of speak in general terms about the way that you teach. It's also important to try to be learner-centered, and what I mean by that is, as you're explaining what your values and principles are as an educator, you don't just want to sort of say, I do these things because they're important and that's why I do them, but rather that why you teach has to do with the effect that you see it having on students in your classroom. So you want to convey that you're responsive and adaptive and flexible to the needs of the students. And you can do this by speaking to, providing a particular example of an activity that you do in the classroom, mentioning what effect you've seen that to have on students, or why you've changed things as a result of what you've seen students learning and taking away from your classroom. So you want to convey that, you're thinking of the student as being central to this experience, and you're responsive to those needs and reflective of those practices for yourself. Additionally, and this is not specific to teaching statements necessarily, but you certainly want to be very aware of and attuned to the particular needs of the institution and the position to which you are applying. And so in a teaching position, this can include things like, you're aware of and speaking to the specific courses that you would be asked to teach in that position, that you're also aware of things like the general class sizes of the institution, that you're aware of sort of the levels, whether it's undergraduate or graduate or a combination of both. And some teaching job applications will have that as part of the posting, so you'll be aware of the specific classes that you're being asked to teach, but that won't always be the case. Sometimes it'll just be a little bit broader than that. And so you might want to make yourself familiar with the types of classes that are already offered. Pretty much every institution and department is going to need people to teach, intro to psych and stats and methods. So it's helpful if you can speak to your ability to cover some of those classes. You can also suggest additional classes that might be upper level seminars that you'd be able to teach and that you're well positioned to provide to that institution. And of course, if they do mention specific classes in their job posting, obviously, speak to your ability to teach those. That's pretty important as well. And it's not to say that every, example or scenario you're speaking about in your teaching philosophy has to relate directly to the types of classes that are offered at that institution, but you just want to make sure you're pretty clearly explaining how the experiences that you've had would apply and could be translated to that environment that you're applying to. And relatedly, of course, if you have taught and designed your own courses, this is a good place to expand upon that and talk about sort of what you learned and what you would continue to do as a result of those experiences. And I also want to point out this can be a good place to speak a little bit about how your clinical training and clinical work and your research could inform your teaching in terms of what that could offer or provide for the courses that you have designed or that you're proposing. At some teaching institutions, you'll be joining other clinical and counseling faculty, but certainly at smaller colleges, you may not be. You might be the only clinical psychologist there. And so it might not be as readily apparent to folks from other fields within psychology how something like clinical work could apply in the classroom. So it can be useful to try to spell that out a little bit more depending on the nature of the job to which you're applying. And also, even if you haven't had as much experience with designing your own courses and teaching your own courses, remember that, if you've TA'd or you've guest lectured or you've provided clinical workshops, all of those sorts of things, require you to teach. And in some way, you probably thought about what you valued and what you were trying to convey as an educator. So you can certainly draw on those experiences as well. In terms of some of the things to avoid, I would recommend that you avoid relying on these sort of educational catchphrases or buzzwords. So don't say something like, I use a flipped classroom unless you're going to explain how and why you did that in your classroom. So certainly make sure that if you are using some of those things that are more standard terms, that you're explaining and describing specifically what you mean when you say that. And then just as I mentioned, you want to use specific examples. So try to avoid being vague. And then it goes without saying, and I'm sure the other speakers will talk to this as well, that you don't want to just use this as a place to rehash or reiterate your CB, but you're trying to kind of bring that to life a little bit more. So I just posted some questions that I think if you're trying to start thinking about your teaching philosophy and how you view yourself as an educator, these could be some useful things to kind of think about. So what do you want students to learn in your classroom and why? What is it that you value about teaching? How do you know when you've taught successfully? So this can be things like the assessment measures that you use in your classroom, ways that you assess student success and outcomes. You can also think about, and it would be good to address how you try to foster an inclusive classroom environment and sort of address different needs of students who might be in your classroom, particularly, sort of reflective of the institution that you are applying to. And in general, I didn't mention in the dues, but as with most of these documents, better to err on the side of keeping it relatively brief. So maybe a page or two, roughly speaking, is a good target, and it is appropriate to use a narrative first-person tone in your philosophy as well. Now, to speak just briefly to the teaching portfolio, so as I mentioned, this is something you may or may not be asked for, and it's possible that you would be not initially asked for a teaching portfolio, but you might have a request for some of these documents a little bit later into the interview process. And so a teaching portfolio might include things like documentation of your teaching, so syllabi that you've used in your courses that you've developed, examples of exams or specific assignments that you've given. Oftentimes, this will also be the place where you would include things like student evaluations of your courses, and that can be the numerical ratings that they've provided if your institution collects those. Sometimes you'll also have other written feedback available from students. You might also be in a position where you have colleague or supervisor observations of your teaching, and those can be really useful things to include as well. If you are able to, it can be helpful just to include all of the student evaluations rather than picking and choosing, because you don't want it to look suspect that you selected certain pieces of student feedback and not others. But if it's not practical or feasible, it would be a good idea to at least include a range of student feedback that speaks to different types of strengths. So, some things that reflect on sort of this person was very accessible, but maybe also kind of a conversion narrative of sorts, somebody saying, I didn't really like psychology, and then this person taught me, and now I love it. So sort of speaking to different areas of strengths that you can provide as an educator. And then this could also be a place where if you've attended seminars or, published on teaching and learning, that kind of thing, you might include that type of material here as well. I also just wanted to mention, because you might very well be asked for a separate research statement if the position to which you are applying does include some component of research, but there are a few things that might just differ a little bit about this type of statement in the context of a teaching-oriented position. So just bear in mind that it's quite possible and probable that things like the funding, the resources that you have available, the subject pool might be different at a smaller teaching-oriented institution than it would be at a larger research-oriented institution. And so as a result of that, you just want to make sure in your statement that you're being very clear, that you understand and are aware of the types of resources you would have available, and that you have a realistic and feasible plan for your research at that institution, if that is something that would be expected of you. Additionally, a lot of times, especially the small liberal arts colleges, really value including undergraduate students in your research and in your research lab. And so this can be a good place to speak to how you have mentored undergraduate students in laboratory involvement, how you've worked with them or mentored them or supervised them in the past, and how you could continue to do this in that particular role. So those are just, we'll hear a little bit more about research statements, but if you're fine-tuning those for a teaching-oriented position, those are just a few things that could be helpful to keep in mind. And then finally, I just wanted to provide some additional resources for folks who are getting started with their teaching statements or teaching philosophies. So the University of Michigan has a really great resource for this type of material. They actually also have a number of example teaching statements posted there, so that could be really helpful to look at. And then Iowa State University also has a similar database, and they provide some other good questions as you're getting started with your teaching philosophy. So that's all I wanted to get to today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalton. Up next is our presenter, Dr. Daniel Capron.
I'm going to be talking about writing a personal statement from a research perspective. It's kind of fitting that I'm doing my first webinar here through this ADAA Early Career SIG. I did my first poster at an ADAA conference, my first talk at an ADAA conference, and my first publication ever was in ADAA's official journal, Depression and Anxiety. In preparing this talk about personal statements from a research perspective, I'm guessing that most of you are already in grad school or even on internship or postdoc. And as Elizabeth kind of alluded to, as the further you go along in your career development, the less likely you are to be writing a just personal statement. By the time you apply for faculty positions, it's really kind of a combination of a teaching statement, a research statement, and a cover letter. However, because this topic was on personal statements, I'm going to be focusing on that.
Dr. Capron, so sorry to interrupt. I just sent you your webcam request just to turn on your camera.
Oh, okay. I thought we were sharing.
There you go. Okay. Thank you.
Can you see my slides?
Yes. So you just have to put it on slideshow mode, and then you should be good to go. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Thank you.
So let me begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I have a very long commute, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks. My favorite book I've read in 2018 so far is Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse. I just completed the Big Easy half marathon in New Orleans last month. And because I live near New Orleans, I've gotten really involved in the culture, the history, food and drink. Okay, so how many of you are excited to hear about my, hot takes on personal statements? I'm guessing not that many. However, I read so many personal statements that have details that are even less relevant than that. So all of those things are true about me, but they really have nothing to do with my research career, and thus they're not really going to be of interest to people who are reading your personal statement for a research field. And I think what it comes down to is that too many people see personal statement and they look at they think of that second definition of personal concerning one's private life, relationships, and emotions, rather than matters connected with one's public or professional career, when really the personal statement is more of that first one. What makes you distinguished from your peers in terms of your research? So what do you have that's particular to you? So let's try this again. Why should you trust me and my takes on this subject? I went to Florida State University, which at the time, and I believe still does, had one of the highest psychology research grant kind of incomes. Since I became a professor in 2015, I've had a lot of success in extramural funding, publishing, and I've been very active at conferences. And in addition to this, I've always had an interest in mentoring. I've probably helped dozens of students at this point over the last 10 years apply to grad school, internship, postdoc, etc. So I've kept up on what literature there is on this, as well as asking a lot of people over the last 10 years about what they expect in a personal statement. And really, the consensus is, unfortunately, that a personal statement can usually hurt you more than it can help you. So I think your number one goal has to be to avoid creating a negative impression. And that's a bummer. You don't want to be avoidant and whenever you're going into something. But, after doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of people, I really think that that's the number one thing to have in mind. In terms of what you should be doing, the next most important thing is showing a clear fit. Depending on if this is a faculty position, really you're showing the fit with a program, but for a postdoc, for internship, showing a clear fit with a potential mentor and the program. Really expressing in a clear and dedicated way what your goals are so that the program knows that you're someone that's committed to this field and the research that you set out to do. Being a researcher is about writing. Nobody pays you to do the fun stuff. They pay you to sit down and write about it. So this is a great chance to demonstrate some skill in writing. And then finally, it's really important to show, your personal qualities, the things that people like about you and that the reasons why they want to work with you. However, it's really important to show them and not tell them, because it's easy to kind of come off as a narcissist. So in terms of avoiding problematic personal statements, this was written, this is the only, I think, empirical study where they actually asked people, what are the kisses of death in a personal statement? What, do you see that makes you less excited about an application? And this is written for students applying to graduate school. However, I think these kisses of death apply definitely all the way through. So the first one, references to personal mental health. I've added family here. Researchers in psychology know about genetics. A lot of people do become interested in psychology because of their own personal mental health issues or family and friends' mental health issues, but a personal statement for a research career is not the place to really expound upon that. You really want to be focused on the professional, on the career path, and not on, the personal side of things. Excessive altruism. So you're in a helping field. Psychology is about helping people. If you say something like, people have always come to me for help with their problems, you just sound sort of naive, because everybody in this field is interested in helping people in some way. Excessive self-disclosure. Many people have really interesting narratives and stories, have come from underprivileged backgrounds and had great success, but these authors recommend that it's safer to have a letter of reference talk about that instead of you talking about it, just to avoid some conclusions that might be drawn. And then generally things that are professionally inappropriate. They give an example of someone that listed their experience as a porno actor. Obviously, that's not going to really have much relevance to research, and much more likely to scare people off than to excite them. And humor, I mean, in the interview is a time to potentially show your wit and your sense of humor, but in writing, it's just so difficult. It's better to avoid the humor, avoid the cutesy, clever stuff. They also mention that, of course, it's fine to be religious, but excessively religious references, such as, God put me on this path to study depression, are likely to be received poorly. Another way to kind of think about things to avoid in the personal statement are avoiding the 3 H's from Norcross and Sayette and the Insider's Guide to Applying to Psychology Programs. And again, this has a lot of overlap: avoiding humor, avoiding hyperbole, and avoiding hard luck. So hyperbole is one that we didn't really talk about in the last one. I just read some applications that just really turned me off, that said things like, I'm going to be the most qualified student you receive, application you receive this year. It's just, number one, likely not true, and number two, just kind of throws off the narcissism red flags. It's not a good look. In terms of the positive things that you do, obviously we talk about fit with everything. How do you actually show that good fit with a program if you're applying for a faculty position, and a mentor if you're applying for postdoc? Well, it all comes down to doing research on the program. So you need to include a lot of details and specifics, and you want to come in and say, how do you complement what they already have, but how can you extend that further? How do your existing skills work with that team, and how can you make everybody else's research better with what you're going to bring to the team? You also want to show enthusiasm. It's amazing when you're on the application side, you think, oh, I'm going up against 100 people. But once you're on the reviewing side, you realize that, most of the really good people, everybody is fighting for. So nobody's really winning in this application situation. So by showing enthusiasm for a program, you're much more likely to get interviewed. A lot of universities are in geographically undesirable areas, so showing enthusiasm for the program in the university there is also going to help you. And again, the way you do this, specifics, so mention specific opportunities they have for young faculty, maybe that you've seen on the website. And if it's a postdoc, maybe mention some specific methods or techniques that will expand on your kind of core set of skills that mentor can help you with. In terms of your clarity and commitment to goals, how do you show that? I think that the best way is to kind of start broad with how you got interested in that particular research area, and then describe what you've learned at each step, kind of ending very specifically with kind of why you're the perfect person for that research position right now. In terms of writing skills, it still amazes me how many applications I read or help students with applying to internship, postdoc, faculty jobs that have these kind of creative openings with lots of flowery language. Scientific writing is very clear, precise, informative. You look naive, and you don't look like you're ready to, I think, take on that next role when you overemphasize kind of the creative writing. You just don't do a lot of creative writing in a research career. I also see this kind of phenomenon of people that I call it trying to get your money's worth from the GRE. So I've included some quotes down there. Any word that you have to hunt for in a thesaurus is the wrong word. I agree with that. Throw out your thesaurus. I had the pleasure of taking a class with Roy Baumeister, a prolific writer, And he just kind of summed it up really well for me. Use big words because they are more precise and concise, not because they sound good. And using big words only to sound smart almost always will backfire. One of the most important things, and something that's just very difficult until you get a lot of practice with this, is showing your valued personal qualities instead of telling people about them. So instead of saying I'm responsible, I'm teachable, I'm flexible, give examples that show a time when you were responsible or show that trait that you have of being responsible. So say that I was project coordinator on a $1 million study under my major professor, and in that study we ran 200 participants in 2 years. Give examples, give specifics, give details that show these qualities. Don't just tell people about them. Something I'm seeing more and more, which I don't see a lot of advice on in terms of the literature, but I kind of like, are kind of having a limitation section. Obviously, in research, every project has a limitation section because there's no perfect studies. There's also no perfect applicants. So by addressing a limitation head on, you demonstrate maturity and self-awareness. So again, showing those great qualities instead of telling people about your qualities. And it's very unlikely, if you have kind of a major red flag in your application, that the person reading it is not going to notice it anyway. So this gives you a chance to kind of control the narrative around that. And I think that a lot of people are scared of individual differences, but in reality, they're a positive for researchers. If you're kind of coming from an unorthodox path, you probably have innovative and creative ideas that most students won't have. So to wrap things up, you definitely want to start early. This is usually a 1 or maybe 2-page document, so it doesn't seem that intimidating, but you want to get a lot of feedback. This is something you should revise again and again and again. I would, spend weeks on it, not days. You want to be aware of the reviewer's mindset. So if you're applying for graduate school, there's, good researchers are getting probably 30 to 50 applications each. So they have to find, hours and hours in their schedule that they don't have. I know when I review applications, I'm grumpy. So again, don't put things in the personal statement that are going to trigger that. With internship, it's probably worse in terms of looking at applications in the hundreds, and same with research faculty positions, likely to be this huge pool. So you don't want to do something that turns off the person reading it right away. They're just going to throw out your whole application. Postdocs usually are a smaller pool, but again, I wouldn't risk it. And yet, to reiterate, the thing I read the most often and what came back to me from talking to people is that the best statements, personal statements, make you memorable in this good way, but in general, they can hurt you a lot more than they can help you. And the final thing, just like you dress for the job you want, not the job you have, write for the job you want, not the job you have. So if you're writing for a faculty position, talk about things that professors do that you do. Don't sound like a grad student. They'll think of you like a grad student. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Capron. Now we will move on to our final presenter, Dr. Nathaniel Van Kirk.
There we go. All right. Can everybody see my slides? I guess so. Looks like it. All right. Well, Astrid, thank you very much, and just want to say thank you to Elizabeth and Dan also for making kind of my section easy. You all covered a lot of the really great points about writing personal statements kind of at varying different levels. So I'll give a little bit of just kind of why I'm talking about the clinical piece.
Dr. Van Kirk, sorry to interrupt. Right now I see your GoToTraining browser. I don't see your PowerPoint. There you go.
That working?
Yes. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
So I've kind of meandered across a lot of different areas over kind of over the last few years, including kind of after internship and postdoc, kind of actually going into kind of research for a couple years, and then now switching back to clinical. So in my current position, I actually oversee kind of the group therapist for a variety of different types of clinical units across McLean's campus. So I get the opportunity to read a lot of different personal statements, both from psychology and outside of psychology, and for a lot of different specialties. So I'm just going to try to summarize some of the things that I look for and that I've talked with others that they look for across the different levels, and just kind of expand on some of the pieces that Elizabeth and Dan mentioned as they relate kind of specifically to clinical positions. So one of the ways that I think about it is when I'm looking at a personal statement for a kind of clinical position, one of the things I really want to see is that personal statement as a way to kind of tie together your experiences and your CV. We'll always look through the CV, but one of the questions I always have is, how does this kind of link together? There are times, especially based on which school you went to or what your training experiences may be, that sometimes it may seem like they jump around a little bit. And so one of the questions that I ask myself is, how do all of these tie together in a way that it kind of led you to apply to this specific clinical position? So kind of on a broader level, I want to kind of be left with this idea of wanting to know more about you, but also have enough to understand kind of what brought you to apply to this position and why is it kind of unique in terms of not just I apply to every position, but there's something about this that I actually do like. The other piece of it that I think about is when you're writing that personal statement, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this kind of in a clinical setting, I also think of it as telling a story of how all these fit together and how they fit together with what you're passionate about. Especially in kind of more intensive clinical settings where maybe you're working on an inpatient unit or working with on dual diagnosis tracks, the clinical work can really take a toll at times. And it can also be something that, it's important that you have a passion kind of for what you're doing, because you may get very difficult cases. And, as kind of a supervisor and as someone who's looking to hire someone into a clinical position, I also want to see a little bit of that kind of resilience piece and that kind of interest in what they're doing and moving the field forward. So the other thing that I kind of think about is kind of providing a sense of why is it that you're applying to this position compared to all the other ones. Especially with clinical positions where there's a wide variety of the type of clinical positions you can apply for. There's also a number of different clinical positions that come up over time. One of the things that I always want to hear from that personal statement is, why is it that you're applying to this one? Something to keep in mind is that if you're applying to a variety of clinical positions kind of within a larger organization, so maybe you're applying to multiple positions within a kind of single hospital setting, a lot of times the person that's reading your application will also know that you've applied to all these other jobs within that same setting. So it's one thing to kind of consider is trying to tailor it to make sure that it makes sense why you're applying to this one as well. And so kind of I'll go over a lot of these. I think Elizabeth and Dan already hit on most of these do's and don'ts. So a couple of the do's that I have when you think about it is when you're telling a story, I think Dan brought up a really important point of you're telling a story, but you're not necessarily telling a long story. I think having a succinct story that really tells how it all fits together is really important, because you will get a number of personal statements and things to read through. And at a certain point, if it doesn't feel like the paragraphs are connecting together, or if it feels like it's going on too long, or maybe like the first couple paragraphs didn't really relate to exactly what the type of position or the clinical experiences that would relate to the position you applied to, a lot of times people will start to skim at that point. And so one of the things that can be helpful is also starting to think about, what are the 2 or 3 main messages that I want my readers to take away from this? What is it that I'm trying to say? And to kind of show that common thread using those messages throughout your training and your work experiences. What is it that ties all of this together? And as been mentioned before, I think being specific is incredibly important, kind of that show, don't tell. The more specific you can be about your kind of examples, your clinical examples, clinical situations, the training experiences that you've had, I think the better off that you'll be. The way that I tend to think of this is kind of like starting a paragraph with, throughout my training, I learned blank, versus while I was working with veterans on a dual diagnosis track, I had the opportunity to blank. One of those gives me a much greater context of kind of the types of trainings that you had and some of the specific things that you've experienced and learned from as you've gone through your training. I think for clinical positions especially, another important thing is to be authentic. When we're writing, kind of remember that you will be coming into an interview, hopefully, and you're going to be sitting in a clinical setting, and all of us being psychologists too, we kind of know when things don't necessarily align really well. So you want to be careful to be authentic and not misrepresent kind of what it is that you're interested in, and make sure that what you say in the interview and what your CV says and what your personal statement says do kind of tie together and line up. And as been said before, don't just regurgitate your CV, because we will read that as well. That I would say that kind of ignoring some of the impactful experiences can actually be to your detriment. So a lot of times through our trainings, I've read about a number of really unique training experiences that people have had over time. And sometimes I think the tendency may be to, if you're not sure how it fits in, to just kind of ignore it and pretend it didn't exist. But I think a better way to do that, especially for clinical settings, is kind of show how that may fit into your professional development. How do some of these unique training experiences you have actually make you a stronger applicant? And then kind of, as been said before, being overly general can really limit kind of the impact of your personal statement. So in some ways, given how many personal statements someone may read kind of in one sitting, you are kind of making a pitch. And so one of the things that I think about is, what is it that you want to reinforce for your reader? You want to reinforce your main messages, the main takeaways. Why is it that you're applying for this job, this clinical setting? Why are you interested in the population or the type of treatment setting that you're applying for a position for? And what are the things that you want your reader to know and want to take away that you think will kind of lead them to bringing you into an interview? One of the other things that I've talked a lot about with kind of students that have gone through this and some of the staff members that have applied for various kind of clinical jobs is sometimes we kind of default to this chronological order when sharing our experiences or trainings. But that can be difficult at times, especially if you maybe have a matching system for your practicum experiences, where the chronological order isn't easy to necessarily tell the story of how this all fits together and how this has kind of developed your expertise. And so there are multiple ways that you can tell that story, with chronologically only being kind of one of those. I think showing how they fit together and how kind of these different training experiences have actually enhanced what your focus is, enhanced what your kind of main clinical or theoretical orientation is. I think those can actually be very helpful in getting people interested in what it is you have to say. And then this one I always took from a marketing class and a business writing class, where the one main thing they said throughout the entire semester, and I've kind of carried it with me since undergrad, was whenever you're writing something like this, it can be important to introduce what the main messages are, kind of tell it to them again through experiences, through specifics, and then at the end, you kind of want to drive it home, kind of bringing all of these pieces back together so that the last thing that they kind of read and take away is the messages that you want them to focus on. And so in order to do this, there are a couple of really important steps. One is learning about the clinical setting you're applying to. Just like in teaching or research, clinical settings are very diverse. There's a lot of different types of clinical settings. There's a lot of different focuses that they may have. I really do think kind of knowing what setting you're applying to and the type of position that you're applying to can help you kind of focus your clinical and internship and postdoc and other training experiences. Kind of help you put them into context for how they may fit for the person that's reading your personal statement. I would also say that one of the cautions that I kind of run into is sometimes when applying for a clinical position, people are hesitant to put in any of their non-clinical experiences. But I would actually say that when I'm reading them, that's actually one of the things that I would look for is, what are the non-clinical experiences, be it teaching, supervision, research experience that you've had that enhance your clinical ability? How do you translate between these different domains? Because that also kind of answers some of those questions around what is it that you can bring to my program if maybe if it's an individual, like say intensive setting that has a very specific focus. What is it that you can bring to the program that can add to what we do? What's unique about your training experiences that kind of set you apart from everyone else? But with that, you also want to kind of balance the breadth of your training with showing your clinical focus and expertise and how it aligns with the goals of the program itself. So I'm just going to kind of end on a few special considerations so that we can kind of get to questions. But a few that I think about when applying to kind of clinical positions is, the training and supervision experiences. Sometimes this can be forgotten because we think of clinical positions as kind of solely focused on client care, providing treatment. But in many of these settings, whether it's a private practice, whether it's community clinic, whether it's a teaching hospital or an intensive inpatient residential setting, there is a lot of training and supervision that actually goes along with staff of different levels. And so I think actually commenting on your training and supervision experiences is very important. One thing that also sometimes does get forgotten is to actually include what your theoretical perspective and theoretical orientation is and how you kind of approach case conceptualization and things like assessment. Sometimes we get so focused on including our experiences that we forget to actually say what that culminated in. So I do think that's very important to kind of highlight your specific kind of treatment approaches in which you're proficient, and your kind of theoretical perspective and your approach to case conceptualization and treatment. Another thing that can be important to consider when writing these personal statements for clinical settings is the type of clinical setting that you're working in. So the way that you may write your personal statement for a community clinic or a private practice, if say you're applying for for kind of a clinician specific job, will be very different than if you were applying to say a teaching hospital or a academic medical center. So in a community clinic or private practice, you may want to think about the type of treatment or the populations that are served, and this may help you balance how much you focus on kind of your specialty versus your ability to kind of serve a breadth of populations and individuals. It also kind of gives this idea that in these kind of community clinics, you are going to be actually applying to be part of a team, and in many cases, a very small, close-knit team. And so that's another piece that they're going to be looking for is this person someone that can be part of this team and move this forward and that we're going to want to work with and grow this clinic together. In a hospital or like a specialized treatment program setting, there you may want to actually highlight some different aspects of your training or your experiences, especially working with multidisciplinary teams. So how do you work within a larger organization as a whole? Also, there may be a greater focus on things like supervision or teaching experience. One of the other things is if you're applying to an intensive or specialized treatment setting, making sure that you highlight your experiences that kind of led you up to working with this very specific treatment. So part of my time I work at the OCD Institute, and since it is a specialized treatment program for OCD and related disorders, what we're looking for is going to be someone who knows what the empirical research is around OCD and comorbid disorders, but also brings the ability to work with some comorbidities, and maybe has some more intensive or inpatient training experience compared to community clinic. So kind of differentially highlighting your experiences based on the type of setting you're applying to can actually make that fit a little bit easier to demonstrate during your personal statement. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much, and I guess we'll open up for questions.
Thank you very much to our presenters. We're now going to begin answering questions. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the chat box in your attendee control panel. I'm going to send Dr. Capron you a webcam request and Dr. Dalton as well.
Okay.
All right, we'll just give participants a minute to think of any questions. Oh, we have one. When sites ask for separate personal, teaching, and research statements, how would you recommend balancing making them cohesive but not redundant across the statements?
Yeah, that's a lot of statements, right? So I guess I personally would just probably try to keep each of them shorter than I otherwise would for one thing. But you might sort of reflect a little bit on the values for you that maybe sort of transcend all of those topics, and the way that you sort of arrived at your area of passion and interest. And then, yeah, keep it briefer. Certainly the other speakers have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with keeping it brief. Elizabeth, I liked what you mentioned about kind of finding those pieces that transcend all the different areas, because I think if you can kind of find what those are too, it also gives you a kind of unique opportunity to share a lot of different experiences that relate to those kind of core messages. And so you can kind of link all three of those together in a way that actually shows how many experiences you actually have, and the breadth and the depth of your training by using very specific, maybe clinical or teaching or research examples, and kind of how they may translate. But I think finding those core things that transcend all three is really crucial in order to make that happen.
Yep, I totally agree with both of you. And the way I did it for my applications was, since I was trying to show that research was what I was passionate about and what I was focused on, my teaching statement had a lot about empirically supported research, or excuse me, teaching strategies. My clinical statements, had a lot about using empirically supported and evidence-based treatments. So it is, easier than you'd think to kind of like tie that meta level thread into things. But it's definitely tricky to write so much material and not have it be redundant. But I think Nathaniel had an awesome, marketing little thing with that. A lot of times repetition's not bad, that when people are reviewing hundreds of applications, you need to, focus on a few small messages and repeat yourself.
All right, we have one other question. One of my applications has an option to submit an addendum. What is worth noting in that? Would any experience with mental illness that may have hindered my GPA or scores be worth noting?
Again, I think it's safer to have someone else talk about it, one of your letter writers, if you really feel like it's an important information for people to know. I think it's, it's controversial. Some people say yes, some people say no, but the majority of people I've talked to have said it's more risky than helpful.
Yeah, and so I'll add to that a little bit, coming from the other piece of what I do is a lot of advocacy work. And speaking out about having mental illness, and that's why I went into the field. And if you read, so I think it also depends on what your CV and some of these other pieces look like. So if you read my CV, it is 100% evident that, based on the title, some of the talks that I've given and some of the workshops that I've done and trainings, that I do have a history of diagnosis, and some of the kind of advocacy work I've done, there isn't a way for me to hide it. So in a sense, I sort of had to explain pieces of it, but how you explain it is actually, I think, the most important one. And it's really, I think, important to know that while we're in the field and we say that it shouldn't be necessarily an issue, when you're reading 100 different applications, there's going to be someone that dings that as a potential red flag or a potential unknown, unfortunately. And it's just kind of and I think that's something that's important to know, because that changes how you approach it. And kind of as Dan mentioned, you have one of your letter writers address it kind of for you and talk to them about how you're going to do it. But I definitely would say, if you feel like it's something that has to be addressed because it's either very evident on your CV or in other places, and you don't want to kind of pretend it didn't exist, if it's something that they're going to notice right away when looking at your CV. If it's not something they're going to notice, then you kind of have to decide what's important to you and what your line for risk is. But I would get as much feedback from people that you trust that have read these as possible, if you're kind of when you're doing that. And so, I think it also, you have to have kind of consideration of how much do you share, how do you share it, why. It's a really tough one in some instances, but.
All right, thank you. Also, Dr. Van Kirk, I think your audio might be disconnecting a little bit. I'm not sure what's going on. You're just going in and out for a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Is that better?
Yes, a lot better. We'll give participants a minute to send any other questions.
I actually was thinking one thing, and just while people are kind of answering questions about that last question too, I was reminded of, I was talking to some colleagues that were not PhD or PsyDs, and one thing that they told me is that when they're applying to actually grad schools for LMHC and a few others, that they actually have a special section on some schools that encourage them to disclose something around their issue with mental health. But I do think also knowing what you're applying to is important. I think in PhD, PsyD, kind of within that field, it's not something that's as highly encouraged. But I was just struck by that when we were talking about it, that they said like that was a very specific question in my application that I had to answer, and it was highly encouraged, and was told that they're given preference if you have this experience, which was something I'd never heard kind of from my end from going through it. So I was at least just kind of throwing out that idea that it may kind of also depend on what you're applying.
Okay, thank you. We'll give participants like 1 more minute to get any last minute questions in, and then we'll wrap it up. We have 1 more question. For clinical postdocs, what personal non-clinical experiences have you found to be helpful?
So just kind of general non-clinical, I do think the research piece has been helpful, because I think there's more and more, there's a really tight integration within clinical settings of having like routine outcome monitoring, has become a really important thing, and I think most places are doing it. So I think any kind of experience with research or routine outcome monitoring, so diagnostic assessment can be a big one. We don't always think about it within a clinical, if it's a kind of, if you're necessarily doing, I would say intervention is the focus of the position. But I think anything you talk about with clinical assessment or your ability to interpret assessments and case conceptualization is really important. I do think supervised supervision, like when I'm reading, is a highlight. Like if I know that you've been trained in supervision or trained in teaching, it's gonna help, especially knowing that we may have like counselors or mental health specialists, that may need some supervision and otherwise. So I'd say those are really important ones when I'm reading through it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Van Kirk. I think, oh, we have 1 more question. I have my PsyD in school psychology with a focus in ABA with my BCBA, and I'm looking to secure a postdoc focusing on CBT for anxiety and related disorders. Do you have any advice?
Anybody else have something you want me to? I mean, I would say with that highlighting, I do think in many of the settings, having kind of ABA training, having that very behaviorally kind of oriented focus is a huge plus. I'd say highlight that, and then how kind of you move from there into integrating more of like the kind of the cognitive components. I do think it also gives you strength kind of determining whatever your clinical focus is and what kind of population you want to work with, whether it's a specific one or more general. Having ABA training and also kind of having these kind of more diverse clinical experiences can actually be really beneficial if you're working with a population that may have comorbid symptoms, where ABA would be really helpful, because it's not something that I think a lot of people are trained or certified in necessarily, unless their focus is on ASD spectrum and ABA. So I think kind of how you integrate it into what you've learned from that experience, and how that informs some of the behavioral practices you do, and how you integrate kind of cognitive strategies into your conceptualizations and treatment plans, would be a really kind of strong message, personal treatment.
All right, I think that is our very last question. Thank you so much to our presenters and everyone who participated in today's webinar. Our next live webinar will be the final part of the 3-part webinar series presented by ADAA's Early Career Special Interest Group, Learning How to Market Yourself Using a Cover Letter, featuring Amanda Baker, Rachel Freed, and Sarah Kleiman. If you are not yet an ADAA member, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer. Please visit ADAA.org to learn more. We would also like to invite you to register for ADAA's annual conference for mental health professionals on March 28th to March 31st in Chicago next year. On behalf of ADAA and all of our presenters, we thank you very much for joining us today, and please be sure to complete the webinar evaluation that will be sent to you along with an online recording of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.